the whole idea of the shared case in the hospital, instead of moving on to another case, I think it might be useful if we just keep that in mind for a while. I mean, maybe not that we're talking about it every single session, but to just keep it in mind. Because I think, Lou, that you missed the point, or I don't know whether you missed the point. The point that I'm getting from Jason's talk is something that you said earlier, Lou, is we internalize the social system and now we project it back onto the world. So Jason internalized the system and is projecting it, has been projecting it back. I internalize the system, I'm projecting it back, and Loot is internalizing the system and projecting it back. Klaus, via trial and error, has internalized the system and projected it back, and internalized, projected back. So
shapes your expectations.
Well, the challenge is now we figure out a language to agree on. And earlier you brought up psychoanalysis and Freud, and maybe we don't like the word Freud and we don't like psychoanalysis and we're going to use enacted something or whatever. But I think this dynamic is helpful because Jason brought out something that we in the West are not thinking about, and that this, when you live in an authoritarian system, and that's not some theoretical possibility, but that's a reality. And then also this whole question of suffering and just the unintended consequences, and that needs to be really also part of our conversation. And that's another way to say that the Maturana or autopoiesis model is totally useless because a biological system doesn't suffer. So it's totally meaningless as a linguistic, whatever, as a set of language, as a language, it's useless because it doesn't have the suffering, it doesn't have the concept of abuse of power. And so anyway, I find this a very productive conversation.
Can I bring up a point? I like Jason's story, although it was long. It made the point that there's a reality out there. And the question is whether or not we are being too abstract. I am here because for 20 years I tried to change an organization in government. And I'm very proud of the fact that in 20 years I got absolutely nowhere. But I got somewhere when I started to understand systems thinking. And I understand two things. First of all, I looked at structures and circularities, the norms of that. The second thing I looked at was emotions. And I realized that humans were not rational beings at all, that they were highly emotional beings. And the decisions that were made were more tribal than they were rational. And so the problem I have with concepts, I don't think, going back to Stafford Beer, where he said measure, analyze, and understand. If an abstract thought helps you to understand what it is you're looking at, and if language helps you to understand what it is looking at, there is no problem. But if I could go to Hayek's Nobel Prize speech, where he quotes Estelle and said that science is very good for the natural science, functionality works for biology, but the only thing that seems to work for humans is social systems, is intentionality, aboutness. And one of the things I think we seem to miss from these conversations is, what are we trying to do? If that comes first, then we can use language, metaphors, and everything to help us understand it. But we seem to be weaving around concepts more than we are about achieving something. If we're looking at governance or procedures like that, then we will create our own language. As we start to enact with the world and do something, then we will start to create a narrative. Now, one of the things that interested me with Luhrmann, I like Luhrmann a lot, but he never talks about narrative. He talks a lot about communications. And for me, narrative is really, really important because I call it viable language. So when you are doing something, when you are a social group, when you have a purpose, and it might just be to be a social group. Some groups, the Women's Institute, were just there to gather together a group of people. If that is your purpose, then slowly you formulate a narrative. And the reason I call it is interesting, why do humans use stories all the time? Or we sit down and we watch stories at television at night. And we could go back to Joseph Campbell, who said there's a monomyth, that there is only one story, and that is the story of a hero's journey, and that we write that story about ourselves. So we write our own, we become the hero of our own stories. But actually, when you look at a group, they always create a narrative. It's almost imperceptible, but it's slowly created. They create their own myths, their own sections of it. But it has everything that a viable system has. It has autonomous subjects that are linked together with cohesion to create an overall coherence. It has anticipation. So I could say, my father drives a train. He takes the train to London every day, and in London, he picks up passengers and he brings the passengers home. Each of those sentences is autonomous, but each sentence has coherence. It links to the next sentence. And overall, there's a coherence, the whole story. And you will automatically be expecting the next sentence in anticipation, system 5.
All your sentences are... I'm sorry.
Sorry,
all
I
your
could also
sentences
say,
are you.
my father drives a train. You can train a dog to bark. Bark lives on trees. Each of those sentences is autonomous, but there's no cohesion and there's no, each has cohesion, but there is no coherence. So when we are creating a viable language, what we are doing is using that, I don't like the word representation, because it is mixed in with the actual social action that we're taking, but we slowly create a mutual model of what it is we're doing. So if we translate that to our own group, the first question I ask is, what are we doing and how are we creating a narrative?
May I comment on that, please, Jonathan? Many people talk about narratives here, narratives there. I understand that other people talk about discourse, other people talk about communication. But with respect to the use of the term narrative, as an educationist, I've been used to making a distinction between episodic narratives, which are like storytelling, adventures, who went where and did what, and expository narratives, which set out some body of subject matter, like quantum mechanics or addition or something like that, which entails a whole lot of a mindset in terms of cohesion and clarity, examples, activities, and so on to get the story across. So there are distinctions to be made in there with this term narrative. That's all I would say.
Yes. So I'm using a psychological definition of narrative, which is basically telling a story. And as you're right, I mean, it's a subject as big as cybernetics itself. That the issue that you have with narrative is when groups, in my belief, is when groups create a narrative, often the bits don't fit. So they make them fit. And one of the purposes of narrative is it has a temporal dimension that is removed from the present, and also a fantasy element that's removed from the present. So, and I don't want to get political, but Donald Trump and the movement in America is very, very interesting, because there was an interesting story with one of Trump's supporters who was, when told something wasn't true, he uttered the phrase, "but it could be true." And what he meant was, it has to be true to fit my narrative. And my narrative is the model of how we want things to be. So narrative itself can be incredibly dangerous, because by removing it into a fantasy and out of time, so we make America great again, we're removing the narrative to a past that didn't actually exist. So we can then make our bits fit better. So narrative can be both dangerous.
Indeed, Jonathan, that's why I was making the distinction between episodic narrative, the storytelling of who did what when, and expository narrative, which are basically how one expounds a scientific theory with evidence and coherence of argument. But you're quite right, in the world of storytelling, episodic narratives, are you familiar with the work of Sir Frederick Bartlett on remembering?
Yeah, yes, and more recent works.
Yes.
But your notion of narrative is, in my opinion, psychological.
Luke, I'm halfway through a sentence.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, no. Frederick Bartlett in the 1930s did a series of experiments where people read a story, with quite an odd, bizarre story, and then told it to someone else, and then told it to someone else, and told it to someone else. And by the end of the sequence of people telling each other the story is quite transformed, becomes something to fit people's expectations of what a normal story would be like. Ironically, since we've been listening to Jason, forgive me, Jason, I do not wish to cause any offense. This is a game known as Chinese whispers, where you whisper a story to someone, they whisper it to someone else, and you see what comes out the other end. Finished, Loic, sorry.
Lowell, you want to say something? Lowell and then Klaus.
Yeah. I just want to build on Jonathan, because he made a very important distinction there. The difference between coherence and cohesiveness. It was between coherence and Jonathan?
So it's the difference between cohesion and coherence.
Cohesiveness. And that, I just want to tell a story from Heights von Forster, 1971. We're down in Mexico. He was, of course, biological computer laboratory. Maturana was there. And I talked to him, and I was coming from a philosophy standpoint, looking at meta systems of play, jokes, etc., just graduating from undergraduate. And it was a turning point, I think, in his thinking, because what happened between he and I was, he was talking about the biological systems, and he says, listen, you're not an engineer, you're not a mathematician, let me show you a book. And the book was The Dream That Was More Than a Dream, that he worked on, published by University of Illinois, on how the meta narratives of Nazism formed, not the psychological, which is Lode's point, it is not psychological, but the meta system which forms and deforms the possibility and horizon of seeing, thinking, and acting.
Very nice.
It was only in 1974 that he really started getting into the second order thinking, going from the biological that he was beating me up with, to say, here's a book that I don't know how to deal with. It's something beyond what we can do in biology. And so I'm really thinking, you know, the importance here of when we talk about narrative, it's not psychology, it's not in my brain. It what forms the form around which. So in T.S. Eliot, when he writes, you know, between the thought and the reality falls the shadow, you know, between the idea and the creation falls the shadow, that's where cybernetics can really add value and provides the meta system that organizes the self-organization of the system. So that ability that we're not dealing with an abstraction being psychologization, we're dealing with a higher level structure. And here's my main point. What we're talking about and continually bringing up about closed systems, open systems, misses the point. The point is, in any closed system, it's an active engagement of formation. It's not just a barrier. It's a paradigm that actively forms the horizons wherein the species, the culture, the tribe activate. And so the role of cybernetics is really to deal with what Jason was talking about is, yeah, you can sit there and do the stimulus response within the system, but you need to attack the system of systems of you know, Jewish folks that are doing Western civilization science and bringing it to China. That's the narrative structure, that there is a disconcerting interaction with the traditional culture that forms and deforms it. That's where the abstraction is real, that Heinz realized when he gave me that book, and you know, was said, you'll never make an engineer, Christy. You don't know mathematics, but maybe you can work on this. And that's the distinction. So between cohesion, coherence, you know, the separate parts and the whole structure, Jonathan, I think it's brilliant what you said. Thank you.
Klaus, After Klaus, Larry, after Larry, Jonathan.
I think I'm really glad that you brought, Jonathan, up the narrative issue. This is actually what I was missing in the narrative of Jason. Jason told his own story, but not the story that he was told as to what the organization is about. I think in sociology, there's a traditional distinction between formal and informal organization. The formal organization is the organizational chart, which person plays which role. The informal one is precisely the collection of narratives, what the hidden stories that stay, in fact, in the system, that you don't want to say it, and you say it only in person, and they construct, in fact, the underlying basis of what one can call cohesion. And there are stories that make an organization incohesive when they are opposed to, in fact, the formal organization. So indeed, I think narratives are important. Now, I would not think narratives being just totally isolated as being stories like fairy tales of mythological figures, but there are many of them that can be enacted. And that is, I think, the critical part for understanding an organization, namely what people share as stories and say, this is what is going on, etc., etc. And it may be a myth, but it is enacted. That is important.
Let me briefly respond to Klaus. I was trying to pose this question to you is, what kind of a system diagram you will draw in the situation of my story? In other words, you had a little you had a little hospital sitting there doing their thing, and suddenly Chairman Mao somewhere far away said something, and then a bunch of school kids poured into the school, put into this hospital, and the whole thing is a mixture of a lot of drivers. So it's really, I want to say the organization versus self-organization, autopoiesis versus autopoiesis. In the real situation, it probably is all a mixture. All the mixture is just the difference is just the ratio of how much of this part you have. Maybe.
Well, it's a mix. No doubt there is a mixture. Maybe there are many stories, but there are some that are shared, that everyone believes underneath, and they are making, in fact, the informal organization on which a formal organization can be built. And if that is not consistent with the informal one, the organization is in trouble. And that wherever they come from is a different issue.
So the point I'm trying to make is that there is a real world. I'm a critical realist. There is a real world that is real. I can't walk through a tree. I can construct a tree in my mind and walk through it, but I can't do it for real. Critical realism recognizes this. So in my organization, I would often show teams of people a picture of Magritte's pipe. This is a pipe, and underneath it, he had written, "This is not a pipe." Okay, and I would say to everybody, "What is this?" And eventually they would say, "It's a pipe." And the artist is being stupid. And for half an hour, I would have a discussion, and they would say, "No, the artist is stupid. This is a pipe." So then I would hand it to someone, and I'd say, "Could the piece of paper?" And I say, "Could you smoke it for me, please?" And they would say, "Well, I can't. It's not a pipe." I said, "You just told me it was a pipe." And then they would realize it's a representation of a pipe. So then I would hand them an email. I would show them a picture of an email, and underneath it, I had become the artist, and I would write on it, "This is not work." And the penny would drop. I would say, "What is it?" And they would say, "It's a representation of work. It is," and I say, "Well, what's another word for that?" And we would eventually agree that that was organizing. So the question I then asked was, why are we doing so much organizing? Why haven't we got self-organizing systems? We seem to be organizing to organize to organize. There are so many emails going on. And the reality I get through to people is that this organizing can become an object in itself if you are not careful.
Okay, so this is a survey.
Larry.
Yeah, I like Jason's story. And I like the provocation with the Paleolithic diagram. Are there systems thinkers there? I would say, first of all, as an observer, could be a participant observer, I would ask the question, are there thinkers? And I would probably recognize that by, when people talk, whether it appears that they're composing, formulating, doing the things that I assume it involves some thinking. And then the second question is, do they have the word systems in the language and use it? And use it in some useful, constructive way. But the answer to those two questions is yes, and the systems thinking is going on. I think the question is, and I could have put Jason's story into that diagram, just replace the different people and parts and put it there. The question is, how do we come to constitute something as a system? Why? And I say, I could, or someone could, constitute the hospital as a system if they want to. They find it useful. I don't find it useful, and I don't find it desirable. The way you formulate a system will have consequences, and those consequences can be desirable or not. In the case of a hospital, it's too much. Either you have to make so many assumptions that it becomes unuseful, or there are so many transactions and interactions going on, you just can't account for them all in that system, and so it's not useful. So maybe I'd begin thinking about a healthcare system instead. When Jonathan talks about military as not being a viable system, I also agree. And I agree in part because it's not useful. I once overheard a conversation between Stafford Beer and a fellow who worked in the US military, civilian. His name was Fred Giesler. And Giesler was trying to make the argument that US military was a viable system, and Stafford was looking at it and saying no. And for me, as someone listening to this conversation, it came down to whether or not there are desirable consequences one way or the other. And I sided with Stafford, having been in the military, that there are undesirable consequences of looking at the military as a viable system. But what constitutes a system is what an observer decides it is. Anyway, it's a comment, and I pose it as kind of a question to the group, because we're using this word system as though it's something that is, rather than something that we create.
Lowell.
I liked your Paleolithic diagram because that was a system. One of the first things that human consciousness created was a god, goddesses, spirits. It was a dual universe that formed, gave them rationale. Did they grow up on, through turtles, upon turtles? Or was this bizarre monotheistic religion of, in the beginning was the word versus an organic system? So humans, from the beginning of our consciousness, started writing on walls and putting iconographic structures. So that's a dual universe. What you demonstrated in a communistic system was the flat universe perspective centered around what? Human hubris, the ability to rationally control a system. And so what is the difference between a Paleolithic icon and a communist system is one says there is an unknown. You could be like the Aztec and sacrifice people for that unknown, or you could be like Francis Bacon and say maybe there's a way of probing into that for the naked brain. But the whole dual universe concept, that's where cybernetics comes in, is what is the construction of that sacred domain beyond our known. There's the boundary. that would be fruitful for exploration. So you don't talk about acquisition within hospitals, etc. That's a management problem of the object. What we're talking about is the system wherein the hospitals exist, and does that have benefit or derogatory consequence?
Jamie.
Lowell, are I unmuted or are I still muted?
Are you okay?
You're
you
okay.
can hear me. Okay. So, so you all know the book, The Closing of the American Mind. And then, you know, the other book, The Open Society and Its Enemies. And I got just an email from someone that Auden, the British poet, also wrote a poem on the open and the closed society. So this is a response to the word psychologizing that Lowell seemed to say we shouldn't do it. So maybe we should have a section, a session that's focused on what are the pros and the cons of using psychology, whatever it may mean. Because I think what is happening, as Lud said earlier, we internalize the entirety of society and now we project it back. And so in our internalization, I have a relation with all the others in society. There is a relation between the self and the other. And then I project a relation onto society. And so we have 7.6 billion people who are projecting whatever they're thinking onto society. And then the ones who are the most in tune with this process are the ones that can become the leaders because they know exactly what to do to manipulate all these projective systems. And that is something I believe is intensively discussed in the literature that are called psychoanalysis. And again, actually, very interesting, Bernard Scott, your Elliot Jack, is positioned on Wikipedia as a psychoanalyst. So, and he was associated with the Tavistock Institute, and that was founded by my favorite psychoanalysis. So maybe I just want to throw that out. Maybe we should have a session that's just focused on what do we mean by psychology and psychoanalysis, and what do we like and what do we not like, and why should we do it and why should we not do it?
Why don't you write a TAO, T-A-O?
Yeah, if I could just add on to what Margarita says, is there's a difference between this therapy of the individual and therapeutics of the system. Cybernetics deals with the therapeutics of the system of governance. It's not about me projecting, I'm part of a democratic experiment.
That is exactly what it is. We're all projecting. And so we need to have a circle, a structure like what we're doing today, in which we give and take, and we listen and we talk, and now we codify it in the form of something that Lud is discussing, like objective knowledge. But as we need to understand what is the dynamic between the researcher / participant and the object of his study. I think that is what it is about. As long as we don't acknowledge us as researchers, we're doing a gigantic amount of projection, then we will not get anywhere. And anyway, that's my position at the moment.
I just want, if I'm allowed, to go back to Jonathan's once more, because I think you made it yourself very clear by saying that it is from a psychological perspective that you are making those negatives. I think if we are talking about the social system, we are talking about sets of negatives and how they develop, how they can be confluent or conflictuous with each other, and how that is different, for example, in policy making or in science or so I would say that this is a different domain. And if Jamie makes the point that psychoanalysis has shaped itself as a domain, I gave that, I can find that quote from Freud where he explains that he sees that he can go beyond that domain into sociology, but that he prefers to stay on the shore. The sociological domain, which comes on top of the psychological domain, is the dynamics of the expectations. So it's not the actions, but it is how we select actions.
Klaus.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested also in therapy, but from a different point of view. I would say Gregory Bateson and Paul Watzlawick invented another kind of therapy, namely family therapy, saying clearly the identified patient is the result of someone saying that he is, and that comes usually from the environment in which it is being said. Now he talks about family therapy, but maybe what I'm trying to do with critical cybernetics is in fact social therapy of a larger system. But I agree. I don't agree with designing government. That is too big a task. I think one has to start with small things and maybe understanding the language that certain things are doing. And so I very much agree with the notion of that we should have to look at narratives and how narratives shape, in fact, actions. And we see this now with Trump. And so, and I don't want to get too much into it, but these are narratives which are believed, which cannot be discounted. And we have no good institutions to counteract that. We have no technology. That's another issue. For example, these platforms that distribute anything avoid personal responsibility. When we talk, we know who's talking, and we hold this person accountable for what he's saying. But we cannot do this with this kind of technology that ruins, in fact, society and introduces narratives that really are very destructive of a democracy. So I think narratives are important, but I think you have to also see that there are some shared narratives, and they make, in fact, a social organization. When everyone says, we are, and then comes something, that is what keeps a particular organization an organization. And so I think this is very important to me, but it all boils to language, but not language in a way, just the way we talk, but how we translate language into actions.
Bob, you want to say something?
I think that we were taught, when we talk about designing government, we're doing it in small pieces. We're not talking about a major effort. So I'm hoping that that we're not too optimistic.
Well, I hope that you would be optimistic, but then take a smaller thing that you say, I was successful.
I like the concept of therapy of society. And as a line of thought which comes from Bateson and then widening it.
Now, Bateson had also this concept of pathological communication.
Yes.
And the pathological communication is where certain things go wrong, and one has to study that. And well, family therapy is just a very small thing, but we have to look at larger things. And now I wanted to say about more general. I see many of our discussions go in one direction that I find useless. When we have a concept, and then we ask, how can we fit it in the concept? Like autopoiesis is a concept, and then we constantly ask, can we fit it and can we not? Maybe that is not the right way to borrow concepts from elsewhere and then try to fit it. Maybe we have to go back to experience and say how out of this we can develop new concepts that are appropriate for a particular situation.
In a sense, cybernetics is the forensics of failure. It is the forensics to find out when crimes of the mind have been committed. And Bateson has a wonderful phrase he used with Stuart Brand when he was with Margaret Mead. He says, we don't know what the lethal variables are, and we're pulling all the levers every day.
But it is failure because there is a mistake of levels. You make the unintended consequences are automatically generated because you make it first personal and then you lift it to the social level.
Bateson's concept of schismogenesis, I believe, is 100% applicable to what's going on today. We have a runaway positive feedback loop, the us versus them, and the more we say, no, it's wrong, the more us versus them. And I think in the past, it was resolved by going to war, but it was always localized. So you go to war, you kill, and then you realize the killing doesn't get you anywhere. But now we have it at a global level, thanks to the internet. So personally, I think Bateson is my favorite cybernetician at the moment. That's dead. Of the living ones, I like all of you.
Lucia, you have 4 minutes to conclude this session.
I don't want to conclude anything, but just add a couple of things. That is about abstraction. That is, one aspect is the level of abstraction. That is, for instance, my background is an economist. Okay, if I agree to abstract from bounded rationality and from mobility barriers and so on, so why to move from neoclassical economics? So that's very elegant theory. I mean, general economic equilibrium is a fantastic theory, mathematically elegant. Everything is very precise and consistent, but it has nothing to do with this world. So the point is that, okay, if we say it doesn't matter the level of abstraction, why to make all this effort to build alternative theories? Because that one is already there since decades, since the 50s, and it's very, very elegant. So my first point is the level of abstraction matters, at least if we want to say something about reality, whatever it is. The second point is it matters also from what we are abstracting. I mean, what kind of aspects of reality are we saying it is possible, I mean, it's feasible to overlook in favor of something, of some other aspect of reality? So, I mean, the question is just both things, is the level and what type of abstraction. I mean, and that is something that, again, fits back on reality. So that's why, what kind of realities are you looking at, and do we share about, is there anything, at least if not objective, intersubjectively accepted? Otherwise, we are just doing monologues against other monologues.
I want to say something about the abstractions. I mean, abstractions are very academic, and but we generalize that also in everyday life. For example, prejudice. Prejudices are abstractions. You know? The French are this, the Jews are this, the Germans are that. And then we act on it, and when it gets politicized, it has tremendous consequences. The point is actually sometimes to go away from these abstractions. And when some people say, oh, the French are, and I say, how many French do you know? It turns out to be either none or one or two, and the abstractions, they take over. That's dangerous. I think with economics, it's the same thing. I think I mean, economics has its advantage because it's so clean, so abstract, so simple, but it also ruins the interpersonal kind of relationships that are left out.
If I can make a comment about economics. Current economic theory is useful to some because they find it has desirable consequences for them. It's when I look at it and I say, if I accept this current way of talking about economics, it's going to have undesirable consequences, and I need something new. It has little to do with what is reality. It has to do with which reality do we want to create.
Lower. You're muted.
You talking to me?
There's a difference between the science that we have today, which is evidence-based science, fact-based science, and what we're trying to do, which is theory-based consequence. How we design our abstract symbolic systems, our theories, has consequence, which is complementary to science 1, and what we're trying to do is science 2, which is theory-based consequence of the design of our symbolic abstractions, narratives, whatever we're calling it.
That's critical cybernetics as opposed to uncritical cybernetics.
Bingo.
And I want to say to Lucio, it's the beauty of our society that we can afford such a system as abstract economics. Not everything has to be utilitarian, or we are using the word use here all the time.
Sounds like everybody is concluding. So time for conclusion. For those of you still have some burning questions and issues or follow-ups, I would recommend you to send me a new title, abstract, outline. Like Jamie, you mentioned the psychoanalysis or psychology or something else so we'll start our circle from beginning. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much for coming for today. Thank you.
Lowell, can you send me the quote of Bateson where I can find it?
Yeah, it's the Stuart Brand's interview in Coevolutionary Quarterly. I'll find it for you.
Okay, thank you.
Send it to me too.
Okay, got it.
Okay.
Yeah, we can share to the whole group, for the group. Okay. Jamie has something to say?
You're muted.
I just was going to say what you say. Yes, share it with all of us.
Yeah. Okay, see you next week.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.